The ancient garden display enables the college and the Menominee people to celebrate and to perpetuate the wonderful research and work that has been done by Dr. David Overstreet and his team. Dr. Overstreet is a noted archaeologist, and he has committed years to helping the Menominee people gain the scientific recognition that we lack, or used to lack, for our legacy as a very sophisticated tribe using scientific principles, and have established a culture here in the Wisconsin region for thousands of years. Let me now then move to the next item on our agenda, and that's the dedication of this exhibit. There's an old folk saying that reminds us many times of what we owe to other people. This saying is stated, "We are warmed by many fires that we never gathered the wood for, and our thirst is slaked by wells that we have never dug." The saying is relevant today, as the ancient gardens display is dedicated. It is dedicated in the memory of Scott Zager. It is dedicated in gratitude to his family for their friendship and for their generosity and for their support and interest in the College of Menominee Nation. It is dedicated in respect for the work of scholars and students in ethnohistory that is giving us evidence, provided solid evidence for the cultural legacy of the Menominee tribe. And it is dedicated in hope that our college will always be here for students who are bright and energetic, eager to fill out and follow their dream, and are filled with promise for the greater community. These named in dedication are among those who gather the wood and who dig the wells, all for the benefit of other people. We are extremely grateful to you, the Zagers and the Piats, and all of you who are here attending this function today, for sharing your time with us. I will now ask Dr. Diana Morris to come to the podium and introduce her faculty member, Dr. David Overstreet.
As we heard, since the Venture Fund was created 6 years ago in the name of Scott Zager, it has enabled 64 CMN students to pursue many special projects. The projects have significantly benefited our college and the community, as well as the individuals and the teams who worked on them. Today's Venture Fund project provides a permanent exhibit of scholarly work that is of great consequence to the Menominee people. We would very much like to claim the source of that scholarship as our own here at the College of Menominee Nation. Indeed, Dr. David Overstreet has been part of our family since 2006 through 2013, but in reality, we have only had him on loan as a resident scholar and a fabulous mentor to our students. His research for the Menominee tribe has taken him to every corner of the reservation and across all of the places where Menominee ancestors lived. Contains enough evidence and insights that it will provide material for dissertations long into the future. And I know that the exhibit introduced today will inspire generations of students and community members who learn more and more about the Menominee Nation. By way of introducing Dr. Overstreet, I would like to share a comment of a professional colleague made at the Midwest Archaeology Conference. She said this: "How does one carry out scientific archaeology? I can tell you in 3 words. Watch David Overstreet."
What I thought I'd do today would be to kind of pay homage in one way to Menominee oral traditions, because it's been a part of the archaeology that I've been doing on the reservation and in other locations for the last 12 to 14 years. And one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that I've been told on a number of occasions that the Menominee, the ancient ones, are the original people on the Wisconsin landscape, that they have always been here. And they take great pride in fact that they still occupy a good-sized portion of their much larger one-time homeland. In that context, the work that we've been doing on the garden beds, the raised agricultural fields, is a very small moment in time. Actually, the evidence on the reservation goes back some 10, 11, perhaps even 12,000 years ago. And we're really focused at this point on just the last millennium, the last 1,000 years or so. So I want you to keep in mind as I go through this discussion, the garden beds are only a very recent aspect of Menominee prehistory that was preceded by thousands of years during which time the landscape radically changed, climate radically changed, and people, of course, changed with those kinds of considerations. I use this title, Certain Mounds and Village Sites of Shawano and Oconto Counties, Wisconsin, a 2014 update, because that's the title of the first systematic archaeological research that was done on the Menominee Reservation. It was done in collaboration between the Milwaukee Public Museum and the Museum of the American Indian, the Hay Foundation in New York. 2 individuals are given credit for the work. One, Lanston Skinner, who was the employee of the Hay Foundation, the Museum of the American Indian in New York, and Samuel Barrett, who was a director of the Milwaukee Public Museum at the time. But in moving along, I wanted to include this to point out, in response to a question that was asked of me today, how did you find all of these sites? When I met the Zager and Piat families, and I responded, well, I didn't find them, other people did. And there's so many folks who have contributed in a number of ways to this ongoing research. I wanted to at least make mention of them. I'm not going to read this list to you, but you can go through them and see that there's wide support for this from any number of agencies and offices within the tribe, within the college, the National Science Foundation, National Park Service, the Scott Zager Venture Fund, among many others who have really moved this research along. I am really simply a coordinator and a compiler of information. I rely on the expertise of many people. So I don't want you to think that I have all this knowledge. I'm really, in a sense, kind of a parasite who goes out to these geologists and botanists and others and culls this great information, puts it all together, and tries to kind of weave a story of what went on in past, what were the lifeways like in this landscape. The work that was done by Skinner and Barrett was really, at the time, at the turn of the century, cutting edge kind of scientific endeavor. On the other hand, it also is culturally shocking to many people because the focus at this time in archaeology was placed on the excavation of earthworks and mounds in an attempt to kind of sort out the human biology of Native American populations across the depth and breadth of North and South America. So I don't want to take them to task for the focus of their investigations because that was part and parcel of the time. On the other hand, they really paid very little attention to the lifeways of the people that they were supposedly investigating. They didn't talk much really about anything other than the physical characteristics of these mounds and what they contain. Skinner had already developed quite a reputation here on the reservation. He was actually given the name the Weasel. That was a reference to his utilizing somewhat nefarious techniques to get people to contribute or sell to him ethnological specimens that wound up in museums. There's a lot of folklore that surrounds Skinner's work here on the reservation and other places. And if you go back through the correspondence in the archives, you can see that around 1910, 1915, in that time period, there was this emphasis in American anthropology that the tribes were changing, they were disintegrating, they were becoming modernized, that there was this collective effort to compile ethnographic specimens, and it was really kind of cutthroat competition between museums. That's another time period in the kind of research that was going on that sometimes is a little bit shocking. Some of the stories about Skinner you can read in academic journals and popular accounts. He went out of his way to actually talk people out of things that they held in some kind of family heirlooms, and he would use Menominee culture as a way of somehow weaseling his way into these situations, hence the nickname. Barrett, on the other hand, was a much more, I think, serious scholar than Skinner was, but I can't tell how much time Sam Barrett actually spent on the reservation during these two time periods when the field work was done. The first year, in 1921, consisted of about 3 weeks, during which time they must have done some kind of reconnaissance. They came back in 1922 and spent a period of about 2 months, aided by some Menominee tribal members, as well as a fellow named Raymond Dart from Green Lake County, who was a volunteer apparently at the Milwaukee Public Museum. We don't give enough attention to the Menominee collaborators, but really, again, it was people like John Valentine Satterlee, who was a constable at that time, who probably was a liaison between Skinner and Barrett and local residents that told them where many of these sites were that they investigated. One site that turned out to be a pretty phenomenal location was the Cackwatch site in the southeastern corner of the reservation. Here you see Skinner. The reason I chose these two images is Satterlee has a reputation as being a very outgoing, human, warm, smiling kind of person. That's Skinner in the excavation hole with his usual grumpy countenance, the same way as his first picture was with Amos One Tree in a cornfield. I have yet to see an image of Alanson Skinner with a smile on his face. In any event, the reason that the Cackwatch site supposedly came to light was that Mr. Cackwatch wanted to build a porch on his house, and on the corner of this porch there was a small mound that he wanted to have removed so he could build the porch, and that's how Skinner actually found the Cackwatch site. And with all of the other sites, they were given information by local residents, and we rely very strongly on the Menominee community, oral histories, written archival records to try and locate some of these areas. Skinner met an untimely death. He was out after his work on the Menominee Reservation collecting ethnological specimens out in the Dakotas, and he died in a car accident. Sam Barrett didn't get around to writing up the notes from Skinner's work and publishing it until 1932. So there was this decade, this hiatus between actually doing the work and then the loss of Skinner, who probably did most of the on-site investigations, and then Barrett left with a difficult task to get this information published. I think that we should be thankful that Sam Barrett was the kind of scholar that he was. He had a background in pomo basketry and many other studies that had been around the country, and he worked with the existing information and published this report. You can still get a copy if you'd like to buy one. It's available from most rare book dealers from anywhere for $150 to $200 a piece. If you're really interested in reading it, you can also access it online and read it for free. And it is a good description of the kind of archaeology that was being done at the turn of the century, as well as some interesting accounts and histories of the people that were living on the reservation at that time. I think largely because of Sam Barrett's reputation, none of this material was questioned. It got pushed into the textbooks. The last time was the compendium done by a Harvard scholar, Gordon Willey, in the 1960s. Everything Barrett and Skinner said was accepted as gospel truth and pumped into the textbooks. So we have references to things like the Wolf River aspect of culture, Kashina tradition, Kashina culture, based exclusively on the work that was done by Barrett and Skinner. And we'll come back to them in a bit. But I wanted to move ahead and give you some consideration of the entire prehistory of the Menominee Reservation. Early sites are very difficult to find. The image on the left gives you a quick explanation as to why that is so. This is the maximum extent of the Green Bay lobe of glacial ice about 24,000 years ago. At that time, the Menominee Reservation, that red dot that's labeled right here, is under about a mile of glacial ice. There may well have been earlier occupations. I always try to keep an open mind, in spite of the fact that one of my professors, when I was a graduate student, gave me a D on a term paper, a research paper, because I was foolish enough to think that there was the potential for finding very early sites on North America, and he said, I gave you a D because you were a graduate student and you should know better than to chase these kind of flights of fancy. I had suggested that there were people on this continent long prior to the Clovis culture. In any event, we'll get back to that as well. This ice sheet, the Green Bay lobe, began to waste, and when it did so, it left a series of extensive post-glacial lakes. We all know about that large lake, that phony lake in the southeast corner of the reservation that we call Legend Lake, that was created by a spillway. There was a much earlier large lake as well that we call Glacial Lake Oshkosh. As that ice front melted, it released this huge body of water so that the lakes that you're so familiar with in the southeast corner of the reservation are really the last gasp remnants of Glacial Lake Oshkosh. Annie Isaacson and his brood just tried to kind of recreate that lake by building a spillway, and they fell a little bit short. They didn't flood half of Winnebago County and other areas. So we really don't have a record of real early evidence within the boundaries of the Menominee Reservation. It may be here, but if it is, it's under tens of feet of glacial outwash sands and gravels, or moraine developments, or under piles of erratics. The landscape of the reservation would have looked something like this immediately post-recession. No trees to speak of except dwarf birches. The landscape during this tundra habitat time is composed largely of sedges and grasses and dwarf birch, along with these large bodies of meltwater lakes. That would have been the landscape that the Menominee's ancestors saw here about 12,000 years ago. As the climate began to warm and the ice continued to retreat, Spruce began to move in first as an open parkland with these large open grassy areas amongst spruce trees, and finally, about 10,000 years ago, into what we call a closing spruce forest, much like the areas of northern Minnesota that are really closed, cold forests that don't have a tremendous array of wildlife that occupy them. The earliest sites in Wisconsin from this time period when the reservation was under glacial ice have been found in the southeastern part of the state in Kenosha County, very close to Lake Michigan, the area of cabbage patches. I was fortunate enough to be involved in the excavation of both of these sites, and I take great pleasure in showing you these pictures because my major professor, who gave me the D on that paper as a graduate student, worked as a volunteer on this site. No irony intended. I didn't rub it in too much, particularly when the radiocarbon dates came in on the purified bone collagen at 14,500 years ago, and when we were able to demonstrate unequivocally, again, not from anything that I did, but from really skillful scholars like Eileen Johnson at Texas Tech University, who documented the cut marks on 3 mammoth specimens from southeastern Wisconsin that date to about 14,500 years ago. What she does with these cut marks, because they can occur in any number of ways, elephants, for example, have been witnessed doing this in Africa. When there are cull kills or drought kills, elephants will come in and move the bones around. Whether they're curious or what that relationship is, I don't know. But when they do this, they sometimes leave marks on the bone. Root etching can leave marks on the bone. Other natural processes can scar up these bones. What Dr. Johnson does is make casts of all of the cut marks that are then mapped on a scanning electron microscope, and through actualistic research, she documents the difference between cut marks, root etching, solution erosion, or other kinds of things, as opposed to those that occur when chipstone tools are used. It's both the striations and the architecture of these cut marks. I don't begin to understand her process, but her work has been accepted, and now very few people question the fact that people were in the mid-continent in southern Wisconsin by 14,500 years ago. 5, 6, 7 years ago, even in some circles today, that's pretty revolutionary stuff. It's pretty nice to have this kind of stuff 30 years from your doorstep where you grew up. The archaeology of Wisconsin truly is fascinating. Another thing that helped was that tucked in underneath this thoracic vertebrae, there was a chipstone knife underneath the bone that I was able to show to a couple of doubting Thomases from Texas who didn't believe any of this stuff and thought we didn't even know the difference between a mammoth and a mastodon. And when they saw the material in situ, they said, I guess it's kind of hard to dispute this. So we were kind of on the forefront of people arguing that there were definitely people on the North American continent long before most people thought that was the case. The prey were quite different in this time period, and it's often hard to get people to realize this. When we think about big game hunters, we might think about things like moose and white-tailed deer and buffalo, but the prey species were of a totally different order. In this area, there were certainly mammoths and mastodons around, although I'm not quite sure we can make a good argument for them being actively hunted. There are a lot of reasons why you should question this. Number one, all elephants of all genera are pretty bright. They're also large and they're also dangerous. Women, lady elephants, are particularly dangerous because they cooperate with one another and they're matrilineal lineages and they're very difficult to hunt. Even today in Africa, when they do cull kills, they have to actually shoot the entire related group of females because they're dying from drought and starvation. But if they don't, that it's such a traumatic thing, that they just actually go into these rages that can't be controlled. So they're very difficult animals to hunt to begin with. More likely, the primary prey animals would have been barren ground caribou initially, and they're great. If you're going to be a hunter and gatherer and rely on a resource, what do caribou do? Number one, they move very predictably to their calving grounds, so you know where they're going to be at specific times of the year. The other thing they do is hang around in great big bunches, so that when you do predict they're going to be there, there's going to be a lot of meat on the hoof in one location. Most of the reconstructions by artists from National Geographic characterize this Paleo-Indian period in the eastern United States as one that's heavily reliant on caribou, and that's where the site distributions should occur. I was just invited by the Museum of Man in Canada to collaborate with about 70 other wildlife biologists and archaeologists trying to reconstruct human demography during the Ice Age based on their reconstructions of caribou migration and calving grounds. Pretty interesting stuff. The problem is we really don't have much in the way of physical remains, fossil remains of caribou from Wisconsin. There's one site in Racine and another one somewhere up around northwest of Wausau where barren ground caribou have been recovered. Another potential prey animal are the bighorn bison, which were extensively hunted out in the western grasslands, but we do have evidence in Wisconsin, particularly in the western part of the state, that bighorn bison were also a typical prey animal, and they were exploited by humans. But again, another thing we have to keep in mind is that the predators on the landscape at the late Ice Age were also very, very difficult. People tend not to think about having the American lion, the smilodons or big-toothed cats, which you may know more as saber-toothed tigers are often called. The chap in the upper right-hand corner, the dire wolf, that's substantially larger than, but probably related to the American timber wolf. These were three of the very strong predators, but the guy that was really important, according to many theorists, is the so-called short-faced bear. I got ahead of myself here. I'm trying to. The short-faced bear, considerably larger than a American grizzly bear, and there are actually theories, if you go through the archaeological literature from the 50s and the 60s, that argued that the North American continent wasn't fit for humankind until the short-faced bear became extinct, because nobody could move into this area of the food chain. I doubt that that's true. We do have a couple of good examples of mammoths, for example, that were hunted and clearly dispatched. There's one from Oklahoma, the so-called Naco mammoth, that had 9 Clovis points within the body cavity. I mean, this is bones. That's a pretty good case to me, that it seems like more than coincidence that you'd have 9 projectile points inside the body cavity if that animal wasn't actively hunted. But for the most part, we don't have that kind of evidence. So in any event, the landscape was very different for these early times. The animals on that landscape were very different. And we used to have this idea about the Ice Age, and it was kind of the glaciers came, and then the glaciers went away, and then the landscape recovered, and when everything was warm and there were trees and plants and animals and whatever, people moved in. That's clearly not the case. With the fluctuations in the glacial margin, in 200 years, the ice, for example, retreated from Kenosha to north of Michilimackinac. Think about that. 200 years is not a long time in terms of the way archaeologists look at time. People were on this landscape all during this late Ice Age, and they simply moved with the position of glacial ice, because on that tundra margin, that's one of the most productive habitats for grazing animals. Barren ground caribou, horse, camel, stag moose, and other creatures. So it was a whole different environmental scenario. We don't really begin to get into what we call modern cultures until about 11,000 years ago. these guys, these Clovis points, the early Paleo-Indian fluted points, for many people still represent the initial recognizable culture in North America. I don't know why we spend so much time arguing about this, frankly. It seems clear to me that these projectile points, these atlatl dart points that are essentially the same technologically, all the way from the maritime provinces in Canada, in Nova Scotia, to the Pacific Northwest, down to Vasaquillo, Mexico, it simply represents a really good idea that occurred somewhere that spread across populations that were already on the landscape. Good ideas move quickly, no matter what the state of human development. So wherever this originates, these fluted points, it's clear to me that they are rapidly disseminated across the entire continent. We still have scholars and reputable, well-intentioned people who I think sometimes get a little bit too welded to their academic theories, who argue that Clovis people or Clovis culture, these fluted point makers, are responsible for the extinction of many genera of Ice Age animals. If you're familiar with Vine Deloria's work, Red Earth and White Lies being a very good example, he talks about how annoying this idea of early Native Americans exterminating the Pleistocene fauna by this malicious hunting of big game animals. It's called the Blitzkrieg theory. And the notion is that about 11,000 years ago, a small group of people made their way down the ice-free corridor in the Northwest, spread across the continent, carrying Clovis culture, and wiped out all of the animals. They must have been on motorcycles and had automatic Clovis trajectory systems to do that. It just doesn't logically make any sense that in the course of the 300 years that this Clovis culture covers, that there could have been that kind of impact on the habitat. It doesn't make any sense. And we see an analog much later in time. The bow and arrow, as we know it, doesn't really come into play in North America until about AD 600, AD 500, in that time period. And suddenly, just like these Clovis points, everybody on the continent is manufacturing small triangular projectile points that look just like one another. So again, there's an idea that spreads rapidly across existing populations. During this era, it does appear as though there's an emphasis placed on large game hunting, bighorn bison, the caribou, perhaps the occasional mammoth, although again, as one academic wag put it, if they ever did knock off a woolly mammoth, they never got over talking about it. It's kind of like the stories you hear at the end of hunting season about that 18-point buck that I almost had. I don't think it was a particular important element of subsistence. Now, at the end of the Ice Age, roughly 8,000–9,000 years ago, we get an interesting thing that goes on in the landscape. We see the development and the emergence of hardwood forests with mixed conifers, and people appear to be, from the archaeological record during this era, a lot less mobile, that they tend to settle down in regions like a river valley. And they learn that habitat very well. And throughout this period, there becomes a much greater emphasis on plants, plant collection, plant processing, as well as certainly by Middle Archaic times and towards the end of the Archaic traditions, there are probably some plants that are domesticated, gourd being one of them. There's some arguments that Chenopodium or goosefoot is also domesticated by this time. But the seeds, if you will, are kind of set in place for a changing life way very early on. And we also get a tremendous amount of diversity. We just looked at those Clovis points and those other late Paleo-Indian projectile points. They look pretty much the same across the entire continent. Now you get terrific diversity, notched and stemmed projectile points that are particular to a given area. This is a period of regionalization when people tend to come to know their habitat very, very intimately. It's over this era where people begin to really build up knowledge about what goes on in their habitat. Rather than moving and following, for example, herds of caribou, they're staying in one generally well-defined region. One of the most interesting aspects of the archaic traditions, particularly in northeastern Wisconsin and the adjoining area of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, is that, and I think this occurs probably right at the late Paleo-Indian to archaic transition, people started to make use of this wonderful material, the native Lake Superior copper. Doesn't need to be smelted. It's 99% pure. The only impurities in Lake Superior copper are inclusions of silver. So it can be worked very simply. It doesn't need to be melted and cast or alloyed with something else. All you really need are 2 sticks and a fire and a sharp piece of stone, and you can manufacture any of these implements. I've seen it done by a guy sitting in a wigwam with a small hammer stone through cold hammering and annealing. You take your piece of copper, put it in the fire, it gets softened up, you begin to hammer it, and as you're shaping it, it begins to get brittle as it cools. You put it back in the fire, you pull it out again and continue that work. It's called cold hammering and annealing. All of these implements were made in that way. These must have been very, very good times for the ancestors of the Menominee people. They were literally sitting on a gold mine. This Lake Superior copper, in both the patty form, where it's cold hammered out as blanks, or as pieces of float copper that were glacially transported, along with a wide variety of tools, are traded all across the eastern U.S., all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico to the eastern seaboard. Much of that copper was distributed along the shores of Lake Michigan, and certainly from the mouth of the Menominee River, and the heartland of the so-called Old Copper culture is Marinette and Oconto and Menominee counties, and the Upper Peninsula counties of Michigan, Delta and Menominee. With this wonderful material, it can be molded and manufactured into virtually any kind of implement, from eyed needles and awls to these woodworking tools that are fitted with elk antler handles, and a wide variety of stemmed and socketed knives and spears and other implements. Now, we talked a little bit about oral traditions. I've been told by any number of people over the years that the Menominees have a relationship to the Old Copper people. It's never made explicit to me exactly what that relationship is, but that people have remarked to me on more than one occasion, we have this relationship with the Old Copper culture. I ran across this interesting figure in some of the Smithsonian publications, a guy named Garrett Mallory, and I don't know if he was here on the reservation or if Chief Neopet was in Washington, but it's interesting that in his book on Native American picture writing, published in 1894, Garrett Mallory, this is his quote. He says, "This is a reproduction of a drawing made by Neopet, chief of the Menominee Indians, and represents the white bear spirit who guards the deposits of native copper of Lake Superior." Isn't that an interesting kind of tradition that maybe strengthens these ties between the Menominee people and this Old Copper culture? The other thing is, if you pass by Spirit Rock, and there are any number of images of Spirit Rock going back into the teens and 20s, if you look, you'll see all kinds of offerings that were made. Tobacco is quite common and most often talked about, but there's a braid of sweetgrass and a pouch of tobacco. But what there also is copper pennies that are often placed on Spirit Rock as personal offerings or mementos. Some of these things seem to persist through great lengths of time. We're talking about the beginning of active mining in the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale by as early as 5,000 to 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. So when we talk about the possible time depth of oral traditions, some of them may actually have really incredible time depth. I raise that issue because there are some archaeologists who refuse to place any reliance at all on oral traditions. They reject them as being distorted, they change, they're not. Again, I try to keep an open mind and look for advice and information anywhere it can be found. And I found that some of these oral traditions are really useful for looking at these relationships that occur in the literature over many years. Now, the woodland traditions typically are addressed in the archaeological literature based on these two major innovations. Those major innovations are the construction of earthen mounds, which are used not only for the interment of the deceased, but they're also ritual precincts. Sometimes they have hearths, sometimes they have other features within them, and don't include interments, that they are areas where ceremonies are carried out. One that's very interesting comes to light, and I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble or not, but I see somebody sitting in the audience back there that I know very well, and I'm not going to mention any names, but I knew her as Myrna Peters back in the day. On her lot, there was a disturbance many years ago of the corner of a mound. When the driveway was put in, inadvertently, it cut a little bit of the corner of a mound. And in that little corner, there was an inverted pottery vessel. And inside that vessel was a cluster of charcoal, carbonized remains. The Language and Culture Committee ultimately decided that they wanted that reconstructed pot put back in the mound and the mound restored. That's what we did. But the interesting thing about this was that we filled out the usual site report and things. Other people began to recognize this ceremony that's fairly widespread. It occurs at Aztalan, and it occurs at a site in Dodge County called the Nitschke Mound Group that was investigated by Will McKern of the Milwaukee Public Museum back in the 1930s. But people are beginning to understand that these mounds are much more complex than simply being places where the deceased are. They're sacred precincts within village complexes. So those two things, mound construction and the development of earthen pottery, are usually what we use to differentiate the archaic from the woodland time period. And we're so wrong, because while these are real interesting and important, the key issue that differentiates between the woodland time period and the archaic is the arrival of maize agriculture, which changes everything on the landscape. There's this tremendous population burst at about AD 800 or 900. Those of you who have visited the Great Cahokia site in the St. Louis area, it owes its emergence to the domestication of corn and the support of a very large population, which in turn, when you have stable subsistence, good economy, if you will, people are left to other kinds of designs. The manufacturers, specialists emerge that are full-time in constructing pottery, or full-time in doing clay tablets or other kinds of things. You also get, with this increased population and stabilization of subsistence, you get internal kind of differentiation, the emergence of real chiefs. I don't think you can talk about Cahokia as anything other than a really complex state-level society that emerged based on this beginning of corn agriculture. But typically, again, in the textbooks that are almost always 10 years behind the researchers, you'll see that it's pottery and earthen mounds that tend to differentiate between archaic and woodland lifeways. That kind of brings us to this sequence, and unfortunately this is not a very good image, but we're now able to trace from the reservation itself and from the surrounding countryside all the way up into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, the trend in ceramic design. The earliest pottery in this area is called North Bay. It's identified from the North Bay site on the Door County Peninsula, and it's about 2,500 years old, very early pottery. If you look at a North Bay 1 pot, the earliest pot, you kind of ask yourself the question, why? It's not much different really than the steatite or soapstone little bowls that were made before that, because the pottery is incredibly thick. They're big vessels that are 1.5 feet, 2 feet high with conoidal bottoms, and the clay is tempered with a lot of rock. You wouldn't move these things from one site to another. I think they were probably more for storage than they were for cooking vessels. But through time, you can watch the technology change with finer and finer tempering and better techniques of firing pottery, the evolution of decorative motifs. The early stuff is helter-skelter. Decorations include scratched lines, incised lines, fingernail impressions. If you take a closer look at some of the pottery in this case, you can follow those trends. When we get to early late woodland, the Hines Creek material, you begin to see the application of pretty sophisticated textiles that are used to decorate these pots. And by the time we get to about 900 or 1000 AD, entire fabrics are laid on the surface of these vessels. But then sometime around maybe as early as 900 AD, there's a new kid on the block. There's a whole new technology that occurs. Suddenly we see the co-occurrence of this point sable collared ware with its really Baroque textile designs that is an outgrowth of the earlier forms, but then we get this plain shell-tempered pottery with no decoration whatsoever, and I have an idea as to where it comes from, but I don't know if one replaces the other, if there are two cultures grafted together. My gut level suspicion is that the co-occurrence of this shell-tempered pottery and the point sable collared, or the shell-tempered pottery, the marrowware, and the point sable collared pottery is the actual co-occurrence of thunderers and bears coming together. That the Menominee origin stories talk about the thunderers coming from the south who bring with them the gift of corn, and that they live together as the Menominee people thereafter. I can't prove this based on the archaeological record because I don't have a nice layer cake that has them together. We get these things co-occurring in garden beds. And you know what happens in garden beds? People hoe them and they're continually stirring the stuff up and mixing it up. So I don't know if, I can't prove anyway, that the shell-tempered marrow ceramics and the late woodland point sable collared ware are contemporaneous. I believe that they are, but I just cannot prove it at this point. I'm going to leave that for the next generation of archaeologists. But it's an intriguing idea. One of the things that's so nice about point sable collared pottery is that people who work with textiles can actually take plasticine impressions from the vessel's surface and then reconstruct the textile industry. That's an aspect of material culture that by and large is missing from the archaeological record. Unless you're fortunate enough to get fabric intimately placed in the ground with copper, and the copper sulfites will preserve it, but it's really rare before woodland times when we can reconstruct entire textile assemblages from the impressions on pottery. And here are some of the bags with textile designs that Skinner acquired, and we're in the Museum of the American Indian. One thing I find very interesting is that this open macrame weave that's taken from a pot, I think in Waupaca County is where it comes from, is very much like this design motif woven into a Menominee bag. Again, one of the ways of trying to link some of these things together from diverse lines of evidence. Well, at the end of the day, when Barrett and Skinner published their report, you get the notion from Barrett's summary. Skinner was long gone by this time, of course. Skinner said that, and his comparison was Avstalin. He'd worked at Avstalin, but from his quote, his summary, you get the notion that he didn't think much of the archaeology of northern Wisconsin. He said it was kind of small potato stuff. And the Menominee and their neighbors have always been kind of characterized as hunters and gatherers and not having much to do with agriculture. This persisted, this misperception, for more than 65 years. As recently as 1997, Ronald Mason, professor emeritus at Lawrence University, published a paper in the Mid-Continental Journal of Archaeology, and he really echoed Barrett and Skinner. And he did so by citing other archaeologists. He cited Marla Buckmaster's work. Dr. Buckmaster did her doctoral research on the Menominee River Valley only on the Michigan side because they wouldn't let her into Wisconsin to work, which she was always very annoyed about for political reasons. But she concluded that from the Menominee Valley sites on the north bank of the Menominee River, that most of the sites were relatively small and indicated just a simple hunting and gathering life way. Robert J. Salzer, who was the former director of the Logan Museum of Anthropology at Beloit College, worked in the North Lakes District in Forest and Oneida counties for years, and also determined that it was pretty small potatoes kind of stuff up here. We get some people that may be trading things back and forth, but no really sizable things. Victoria Durst, the Wisconsin DNR archaeologist, came to the same conclusion. It's like they all went back and read Barrett and Skinner and didn't look much farther into the ground and came up with the same conclusion. Mason went on to say, based on the work of Buckmaster, Salzer, and Durst, that what we're looking at are just indications of trade, sporadic, short-term, mobile kinds of people. Well, the paradigm changes about 1992, 1993, thanks to the Menominee foresters, Jeff Greeno, Ron Walko, and others, who contacted the Historic Preservation Officer about this site that was in an area where there was some logging that was proposed to be done. And David Greeno called me and got a chance to go out and visit this site, and I was stunned. I've been doing archaeology in Wisconsin for almost a half a century now, and I'd never seen anything like this. Visible on the ground surface were over 300 storage features, and we assume that this was probably some kind of a historic site, that it was some late kind of phenomenon. On the site, though, there were also two fairly large conical mounds, about 30, 40 feet in diameter, 6, 7 feet high. One, like most mounds that we have encountered, had been badly vandalized, but also up in this northeast corner of the site, there was a small plot of raised agricultural fields. I didn't know what to make of it because, quite frankly, I had been reading the textbooks loyally as a student for many years, and those guys that wrote those textbooks said this kind of stuff doesn't exist, and by the way, you're outside the northern limits of corn horticulture, nobody could grow anything up there. And then if you look at the historical accounts, like the Indian agents or military people in the 1830s or the 1820s, they tell you that the Menominee were miserable gardeners and had some scraggly cornfields and there wasn't much they could do. They would never be farmers like European farmers, on and on and on. What this discovery did was it set in motion a whole new paradigm for a missing chapter in Menominee history, that it just wasn't supposed to be there. As it turns out, this portion of the site that was mapped actually by Chad Waukeshawn's father did a marvelous job. We should have kept him on board, Chad, for a few more weeks because later in 2012, this is the portion that was mapped by Mr. Waukeshawn in a marvelous job. Jeff Greeno, when we were working out there, said, you guys need to look over here. There's more of this stuff. So we went over and did some additional survey work. Sure enough, Joe Dick Road was even larger than we thought it was at first. Again, the next year, Jeff Greeno came in again and said, you guys better go look over here. And the garden beds of this set are really small in comparison. And there are scattered garden beds that that cover about 8.2 hectares, which is more than 20 acres. Not a small transitory campsite. There are people invested in this landscape. We did very limited work. We talked to the folks from the Language and Culture Commission that came out to the site to visit it, asked them what did they want to know about this site. And they wanted to know two things. They wanted to know what people were putting in these storage pits, and right here we did one very small excavation of a storage pit, and they also were curious about what was being grown in those gardens. We put in a 50 centimeter by 2 meter trench in the garden, and we got carbonized corn kernels and soil that yielded corn pollen. Everybody said it was going to be wild rice, but there was no evidence of wild rice in the storage pits. But what there was this mixture of woodland, Point Sable Collard, and Upper Mississippian shell-tempered Merrill complex pottery together in a storage feature. You can't make too much of that, again, because these pits are low spaces in a habitation area. And they could have been dumped in that hole at any different time, cleaned up and put in there. So again, we were in a weak context of association, but it began to look to me more and more like these things are kind of linked together on the landscape and are contemporaneous. Well, our investigations went on, and through the support of the college and Menominee Tribal Enterprises and the Housing Authority and Community Development and residents, we now know that there are at least 10 major village sites that share these features on the Menominee Reservation. My surmise, if this is representative of the entire reservation, is that there were many more people living within the boundaries of the reservation then than there are today. And that's a little bit difficult, I think, for many people to swallow. But if these settlements are at all contemporaneous, we're looking at a pretty good sized bunch of people on the landscape. Now, we don't do much digging. What our primary focus is, because this landscape is so unique in the way that it has been managed, it's an incredible treasure. You just can't go walk across parts of east central Wisconsin and pick out landscape features that haven't changed over 1,000 years. When I was training in archaeology, it was really easy to do a plan view and a profile. First you wrote in the plow zone, and everything that was mixed up and gone, and what was left was below it. None of this landscape has been plowed, so that these surface features that are over 1,000 years old are still visible if you know what you're looking for. So what we do is we go out and we make detailed maps using transits and tapes. Our technology is pretty primitive, but we make good representational maps of these sites. We put a datum point or a benchmark in them so that 20 years from now, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years, people can go back and relocate them to do what they will with them. They're going to be a source of incredible information in the future. There's a tremendous amount of work that goes on, and again, I think about the questions that the Zagers and Piats put to me this morning about how do you find all these things? Well, you have high school students under the spell of Lawrence Meyer and Ryan Overstreet and Jennifer Dixon and Guy Ryder, and we take them out in the woods and they brush a half an acre. And then we teach them how to do metrical measurements to read and make maps so that you can see here, based on their hard labor and their interest in their work, you can see how these raised agricultural fields look on the landscape when the undergrowth is cleared and moved off the site. The students look a little funny at you when you say, well, here, take these 7 rakes and rake out this area where these pits are. You want us to rake the forest? Well, if I want to get a good photograph, I've got to climb a tree, and we got to get all the litter out of the way. But here you can get an idea of what these dimples in the forest floor look like out on the ground. Keep in mind, at the Joe Dick Road site, Mr. Waukeshawn individually mapped 300 storage features. Our rough count estimate of the new area of the site is that there are 1,000 of these exposed. One of the things I forgot to mention to you in that earlier map of the Joe Dick Road, where we did that small excavation of the one storage pit, when we did that, we identified 4 other storage pits in that excavation square that had been opened up, contents taken out, and then refilled level to the surface. So granted, you can see about 1,000 of these on the surface and maybe 4 times that many that have been filled. That didn't make any sense initially, but once we started looking at the excavation of the ridge fields, it became clear what was going on. The other thing we did, and again, I'd like to take credit for this, but somebody else led us to the site, the small patch of garden beds or raised fields that you saw originally at Joe Dick Road is not typical of other sites. This is the Big Eddy West raised field site on the west bank of the Wolf River. It comprises an area of roughly 20 acres. Think about clearing 20 acres with tools that don't necessarily have sharp edges on them, burning them off, and then using either elk or bison scapula hose and digging sticks to create 20 acres of raised fields. It's not, Ma, Pa, and Uncle Fred and Cousin Louie that do this. It's a community kind of effort where there's a significant modification in the landscape. A lot of people involved. The excavations of these beds is incredibly tedious, but I've been following the good counsel of our collaborator from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who did his doctoral research specifically on raised agricultural fields from Lake Titicaca in Peru to those used by Northern Ojibwa to supply the Hudson Bay Company in the 18th century up in the prairie provinces of Canada. And his protocol for excavation is that you have to follow the microtopography of these beds. And we excavate in 5-centimeter levels. From each 5-centimeter level, we take a variety of samples. 1 bag of soil, Bill Gartner refuses to let me call it dirt because he's a soil scientist. We take 1 bag of soil and we send it to the Smithsonian Institution where Dr. Dolores Paperno chemically treats it and culls out plant phytoliths. And she identifies then the species of plants that are being grown. And again, an incredibly brilliant woman who pioneered this technique. She can even differentiate between plant phytoliths that come from maize leaves and those that come from the ears of corn. And if you get a lot of maize leaves, phytoliths, it suggests that people are tilling those fields or cultivating them during the growing season. Again, something the historical records told us people don't do that. So we're gaining a whole new understanding of Native American agriculture from these raised fields. This careful kind of excavation also allows you to identify things like buried surfaces. During one of our field trips, we had an eminent soil scientist from the University of Wisconsin who looked at me and said, "Boy, you guys are really lucky." And I said, "How so?" And Kevin said, "Well, don't you get it?" He said, "There's no earthworms here. You wouldn't have this stratigraphy if there were a lot of earthworms because they constantly mix up these subtle differences in the soil. I haven't seen an earthworm anywhere in your excavations except down at the Sepashticum site. There's a few closer to maybe Highway 55. They're an invasive species. This site, the Joe Dick Road West site, there's no evidence of earthworms, so we had this really clear stratigraphic record. Well, other samples go to the soils lab. We also collect boxes intact of the profiles that wind up at a place in Pittsburgh for micromorphology. They make a slide so that we have a permanent record of everything that we've excavated. That's analyzed with a microscope, and you can pick out, for example, planting surfaces based on ash crystals in the soil. It's just fascinating stuff. We're learning how smart these people really were and that we had no clue they were this sophisticated. One of the bags of dirt, and I put this in here for Marty Lee and Monet's enlightenment and edification, we float in a system called a Watson-type flotation tank. It's nothing more than a 55-gallon drum hooked up to an air compressor that shoots water up through this bath. You dump your soil sample in there, carbonized plant remains, corn kernels, squash rind, wood charcoal, other materials, seeds, nut fragments float to the top and are skimmed off. That's what you see here as the light fraction. corn kernels, nut fragments, wild rice, and wood charcoal. Heavy fraction, generally small bits of bone and artifacts are cleaned out of the bottom of this tank. Time-consuming, difficult chore. It is no fun at all in mid to late November. We do it outside. Another interesting phenomenon in these garden beds is that there are more artifacts in them than I thought there were going to be. And I know that a watch pot never boils, but if you're living in a summer bark lodge and the kids are underfoot, sometimes back in prehistoric eras, pots did boil over. And when they boiled over, food incrustations were carbonized on the interior rims of these pots. What we do, it doesn't destroy the artifact. We scrape the carbonized food off. We take a few portions of that sample and send them to the Illinois Geological Society that gets us an AMS radiocarbon date. Tells us how old that pot was when that food was cooked. We send the other part of the carbonized food remains to Dr. Paperno, and she tells us what was being cooked in that pot. So we're beginning to get some pretty detailed information about life ways of these prehistoric people by relying on these various scientists. These are what phytoliths look like. I couldn't even tell you how big a micron is, but they're about 20 microns in diameter. And you can see there are differences between the maize leaf phytoliths and the maize cob phytoliths. So she gets some idea as to what's going on in that. The other thing that she does after she submits the sample that we send her to her chemical bath is she picks out individual starch grains like squash or some other starchy plant. It's just mind-boggling the stuff that they can do. This is the Joe Dick Road west site, and I don't know how well you can see it here, but this is rather stunning. It's unfortunate. This dark organic band is the most recent planting surface. And you may be able to discern here a kind of a lens-shaped component of soil that's mixed A and B horizon. In other words, it's mixed topsoil and other dirt. We had this tested for phytoliths because when we did some work with the Forest Service at Archibald Lake on garden beds, I got a note from Dr. Paperno and she said, I don't understand this. I'm a tropical plant analyst, but these garden beds from this Archibald Lake site appear to be full of wetland grasses, maybe wild rice. And I thought, I don't think so. This is an upland location, and all the information we have about ricing is that most of the processing of wild rice takes place near the shorelines where it's available. There are a lot of vintage photographs of people processing rice along the shorelines of rivers and lakes. But here in this upland setting at both Archibald Lake and here on the reservation at Joe Dick Road, we had upland grasses. And I'll tell you what people were doing. They were actually going down into creek bottoms and river bottoms, collecting organic soil that had wetland grass phytoliths in it, bringing them upslope and mixing them on the landscape to enrich what were terribly poor agricultural soils to begin with. You can also see another buried planting surface here. Now, are we looking at a sequence where one planting surface kind of peters out and they've got to refurbish that area and bring more soil in and refresh it or modify it and build up the landscape? Here at the bottom, not so clear, but I think you can see it. There's kind of a dark horizontal band here. That's the buried A horizon. That's the original topsoil on which these raised fields were built. We've collected samples of these organics that Mr. Hong at the Illinois State Geological Survey will radiocarbon date for us to tell them when these agricultural fields were first built. It's a remarkably amazing stratigraphy, again, based almost exclusively on the absence of earthworms. Here you can see a little bit larger section of that mixed AB stuff where it was brought in and dumped on the landscape. The amount of intensive labor that goes on in these fields it's stunning. It's something that nobody had ever contemplated before. We have some examples that are much more interesting and clear. Here you see a reconstruction. This dark thing is the planting ridge and the ditch. And here's one that's built on top. All this is filled. And here's a buried surface. We'll be able to date this garden bed and this garden bed and find out how much time has elapsed between the earlier sequence and the late sequence. So there's a lot of information still to be gained from these samples. Now, there's a lot of information floating around out there, and most of it's pretty simple. The two major theories about these raised fields is that they were constructed originally in places farther south to create a microenvironment that served as frost drainage, that you would plant your maize or whatever you're planting on these ridges, and if there was a late frost, it would drain down into these troughs. The University of Illinois at Urbana did some experimental work back in the 70s and 80s where they built raised agricultural fields, put in temperature measuring mechanisms, and found out, lo and behold, there was a minor difference between the temperature in the ditches and the temperature on the planting surfaces, on the ridges. And it may be true that there's kind of a beneficial microenvironment created. One of the ways that we can find these raised fields is when the snow melts in the spring and you're in the right place in the forest, you can see these linear arrangements because the ridges melt off first. The ditches are actually a little cooler and wetter, so you look for these zebra patterns out in the forest, and sure enough, they often turn out to be raised fields. The other major theory is that, and this is comes from the Plains area. One of our collaborators, one of the Scullens, has been doing gardening for about 20 years, and he claims that the only function these raised fields have is to anchor the roots of northern Flint corn in 8-row maize that comes in really from the plains somewhere around 800 or 900 AD. He's built an academic career on this and doesn't want to listen to other potentials, but I think that it may be true out on the plains where you have these prevailing winds, where they actually see cornfields laid down from bursts, particularly among the Mandan and Hidatsa. But what we're sure about is several things. They're much more complex than either one of those simple theories. They're ways of perhaps moderating the aspects of climate. There are certainly ways of improving soils, and they're amending the soil. They're taking the worst agricultural soils you can think of. Big Eddy West, no more than 10 or 15 centimeters beneath the surface, it turns into gravel. And it's this upland site of 25 acres that it gets so droughty when you're excavating, it's like working in a tub of talcum powder or something. How did these people grow maize on these? To invest the effort to establish 25 acres of raised fields on that kind of soil, I'm sure it wasn't trial and error. They didn't prepare 25 acres and say, well, too bad, nothing grows here, let's go somewhere else. I mean, clearly these people knew what they were doing. And one of the things that we've observed is that the ditches do help to manage soil moisture. We noticed that in our first excavation at Joe Ditch Road, that the soil beneath the ditches within reach of the roots was moist. The ridges themselves, where the plants were pretty dry, but the ditches maintained the moisture. We could see that as well in the field while we were working. We'd be out there, and if you're out in the woods and it takes you 45 minutes to drive where you get out of the truck and another 20 minutes to walk where you're working, when the showers come, you don't necessarily, well, let's quit for the day. You put a tarp over yourself and you wait there and sit on site until the rain stops. We could see the differential drainage where the ditches filled with water and the ridges dried out almost immediately. So soil moisture had to be a big part of it. Also is the additions for fertility. We've got control units. What we do when we approach one of these raised fields is we do our limited excavation, and then we go off the site and dig a control unit so we can compare the differences between the cultivated soil, and the soil that's never been cultivated. In the A horizon on the non-cultivated soils is about 6-7 centimeters. Then you get into the garden beds and you got 18-16 centimeters of really organically enriched soil. These guys knew what they were doing. They were very, very sophisticated agriculturalists. I think the other thing that you've got to conclude as well is that the population estimates, the pre-Columbian population estimates, are woefully understated. And people have been aware of that for a long time. It's still very much resisted in some academic circles, but this kind of information, I think, certainly leans the other way, saying there were many more people on the landscape than we thought. The question becomes, is what happened to these people? This system of sustainable organic agriculture that was practiced for over 500, 600 years shuts off like a water faucet about 1450 AD. There are no radiocarbon dates from any of these sites after 1450 AD. The three traditional explanations have been warfare. Father de Blonde said when he sent back his letter to his bishop in France that the Menominee at one time were very numerous. They have almost been exterminated by warfare. There is absolutely no evidence for any extensive warfare pre-1610 in this neck of the woods. The other supposed explanation that was actually promoted by Reed Bryson, a noted climatologist at the University of Wisconsin, David Barris, an ethnohistorian, and there was one other author whose name escapes me, but in 1965 they published a paper, and the introduction to that paper was lamenting the fact that Europeans didn't get here a little bit earlier. They would have recorded a very different cultural scenario because they got here after the Little Ice Age, when agriculture became virtually impossible. Who knows? Perhaps, but perhaps not. When you start, and Bill Gartner and I have been having this argument out in the woods now for 2 years, it's true that about 1400 AD in particular, from about 1400 AD to 1450, there's this dramatic drop in temperature. But the dramatic drop is less than 2 degrees centigrade, or 0.2 of a degree centigrade. And I don't think you can really look to this neo-boreal or this little ice age, this climatic episode that shuts off this horticulture. I think it would have been something that people might have adjusted to over some time and changed their life ways. People have been doing that since archaic times. We talked about settling down and learning an area well. When you do that, you have all kinds of resources that you have to deal with seasonality and scheduling. How many of you guys picked a lot of blackberries this year? They stunk, didn't they? Yeah, they just weren't there. Some years, the resources just don't have the right kind of climatic conditions, so you schedule something else. When one fails, you've got something else to turn to. So this little ice age just doesn't quite make it. It doesn't explain how this population could have so dramatically collapsed. But what does explain it, although my good friend Alice Kehoe, as well as some others, have informed me that the latest issue of American Antiquity has an article that explains that it's impossible that European diseases could have laid low these populations to the degree that we see it. I have not yet had time to read the article. I'm remiss. I'll get to it. I am not convinced. I think that's really the explanation, that these disease vectors arrive in advance of any Europeans by indigenous intermediaries. And if you have people living in the kind of communities we're talking about, agricultural villages, rather than spread out across the landscape, they're going to be much more susceptible to the effects of diseases that haven't been in the area before. So I think that's what really happened to those populations. But the knowledge wasn't lost. There's some interesting images in the Milwaukee Public Museum collections, and this is only one of a number of individuals who are identified as being traditional people around the turn of the century. Soman Jim, this is his summer camp. Chad Waukeshawn sent me an email that I kind of ignored for about 2 years and finally got around to looking up this thing on the internet, and sure enough, there in the Gene Autry Museum in LA is Skinner's scrapbook with his photographs from the Menominee Reservation. And he shows Soman Jim's camp with his raised agricultural fields and his summer bark lodge. So the indigenous knowledge, if you want to call it that, the lifeways that we see during this 500-year period weren't lost. They didn't go away, but something happened, and my guess is that it was population collapse that would preclude the construction of like these large agricultural sites that were going on from roughly 500, 600, maybe 700 AD up to about 1450. So that's my story, and I'm going to stick to it.